I think the fundamental concern of Peter Watkins's monumental 1994 feature film The Freethinker is the conflict between truth, being honest to oneself, and morality, devotion to higher principles. Much of the discussion in this film surrounding its subject, bastion of Swedish culture and a very important figure in the development of 20th century European art, August Strindberg, reminds me of a very contemporary analysis of an artist or author's legacy. Obviously, this was the film's intent to present a treatise of sorts on the life, contributions, and pathos of Strindberg, both a biography of his time alive and a study of his personality and works. Rather than cutting between dramatic historical recreations and documentary footage of today's experts, the performers of these mentioned recreations begin speaking to the camera in subsequent scenes to explain more context of Strindberg's or one of his associates' lives. Sometimes dramatic recreations will be staged of then contemporary to Strindberg critics discussing Strindberg's work. Interestingly, a lot of what a modern 21st century scholarship could find contentious or controversial about Strindberg's life's work was similarly disdained or criticized in his lifetime. Notably placed under a microscope, what Watkins appears to want to place under particular observation is Strindberg's changing attitudes toward women, including the budding feminist movement itself over the course of his lifetime. Just for some brief backstory, I'm taking for granted those viewing this haven't necessarily seen The Freethinker. Strindberg lived from 1863 to 1912, and toward the end of his life he embraced a lot of social conservatism, which the socialist slash anarchist, communist, whatever of his youth would have very likely despised. It is suggested that much of these feelings, certainly those towards women, were influenced by the unstable relationship Strindberg had had with his wife Siri. Apparently he was convinced, for whatever reason, likely an innate paranoia, that Siri was unfaithful to him. The film also depicts Watkins resenting that Siri's performances in his plays were sometimes more acclaimed by critics than the plays themselves. Oh, excuse me. August Strindberg and his literary devotees are convinced that a writer can write, even ought to write, whatever they want to write, whereas his critics and skeptics are not sure of this. Others are soon inclined to believe that there is a higher obligation to humanity, one which Strindberg chose to betray. In being completely honest about his views toward women, for example, later in life, or his scathing critiques in between attempts at an empowerment of the working classes, Strindberg, some literary thinkers believed, was potentially setting progress backward, was not allowing readers to think for themselves, rather insisting a subjective truth upon them without giving them the opportunity to consider any other view to be a valid or legitimate one. I think the fact that a writer's views could be perceived as an absolute truth is where and why some, in his lifetime or now, had issues with Strindberg writing about whatever he wanted. Because think about it is made very clear how Strindberg truly valued the notion of being a free thinker itself. The principle of being able to write freely whatever he wanted, this was key to his will to life itself, I believe. So even when it came to espousing views you might consider, or his past self might have considered, to be ugly and prejudiced, against women specifically, Strindberg considered himself to be speaking truth to power. He is less interested in any positive societal outcomes of his free speech, and more invested in the validation and acknowledgement of every thought he has as legitimate or justified. He perceives his word, thereby his thoughts, to be gospel. What we soon realize, however, is that August Strindberg is less interested in free speech for reasons of logical fairness, but more for his own emotional empowerment. Strindberg was never happy. He always seemed to find some issue with the world around him. Strindberg may have felt as though people in society were always letting him down, but it comes across more as a man who could never be happy unless nothing bothered him whatsoever. "What's bothering me?" he might have asked, for writing inspiration. "Want your saw to feel sorer? Focus on the saw. Seriously." Strindberg's life story is very instructive and relevant to the contemporary discussions had about human expression in general, where freedom of speech especially is concerned. In the internet age, anyone can be an August Strindberg. Anyone can be an iconoclast attacking whatever institutions they want to via a piece of firebrand rhetoric. Hey, it's free speech. However, to what degree do we purely value, free expression in and of itself? To say we wouldn't persecute someone due to their freedom of speech isn't the same as saying we value what they are free to speak. A celebration of free speech for its own sake is usually predicated on a belief that the truth matters most. I don't think anyone has an issue with prioritizing the truth, At least no one would claim otherwise, although there is a distinction between being honest about one's views or beliefs and being intellectually, rigorously, scientifically even, honest. Well, let me explain. And just to be clear, I'm in favour of freedom of speech. I don't think it is necessarily problematic. Any exceptions to that principle are very begrudging, i.e. deceptively yelling fire in a crowd of people, not remotely okay. Although, how much value do we place in any one individual's speech? Is it censorious to suggest that someone being honest with themselves is inaccurately interpreting their surroundings? Is a schizophrenic's freedom of speech a legitimate expression no matter what? And would it be persecutory to question, disagree, or take issue with something that they say? I don't think so. I don't think so for anyone, quite frankly. Strindberg seemed to take any issue with his work as an attack by those who would censor him, although I think his critics were less authoritarian, I think, and more were concerned about the truth, if any, behind Strindberg's beliefs, whether he was just being an emotional or even psychotic ranter or a considered careful thinker. It became apparent to everyone that Strindberg considered everything he wanted to write to be coming from a place of objective, honest truth. He didn't consider it possible, seemingly, for him to be mistaken, misled, or to misinterpret any stimuli that came his way. Now, if the study of the great acclaimed, much discussed author Strindberg isn't paradoxically relevant to the lives of anyone who desires to post the contents of their mind online, I don't know what is. Adam Curtis once remarked that in the social media age, the epoch of paranoia, living for appearances and terror what others think of one, everyone has adopted the iconic, once unique pathos of former American President Richard Nixon. I don't know if we're all Richard Nixon. I don't know how many of us would be willing to just go into people's houses at night and wreck up the place, although I'm beginning to believe that, if we're not careful, we will all become less acclaimed, revered, and or discussed August Strindbergs. Oh well, that's the times we live in. I ought to mention, at around the 3-something hour mark of this film, the subtitles disappeared, eventually returned, but were apparently out of sync. Some of this is even documented in my screen caps. One English subtitle does not match the Swedish text on the screen, for example. Maybe one or some purists could argue that I didn't see the complete film and therefore cannot offer an opinion on it whatsoever. And yeah, possibly, although I'll still finish this write-up for no other reason than to just annoy any of those people, assuming they even exist. The Freethinker is the first film from Peter Watkins I'm actually discussing on this program. I'm in reverence of Watkins' filmography. He was simply one of the great artists of 20th century film. He has not released a feature since the year 2000, which is somewhat disappointing, although the body of work he leaves behind is simply phenomenal. Watkins tends to employ visual techniques that mimic documentary film, even if his subjects are completely staged, recreations of an historical event or of a hypothetical future. A documentary aesthetic is employed in order to grant the production an inescapable sense of realism, of authenticity, and lived-in believability. He got his popular start, directing the 1965 controversial television broadcast The War Game, featuring a frighteningly realistic portrayal of a nuclear bomb landing in England. The Freethinker is one of Watkins' strongest films, in my opinion, though it appears to be at least slightly lesser known. I would implore one to try and track down the Freethinker if you are so inclined, although do be wary of its daunting 4-hour runtime and also of this tendency for copies to be not subbed to completion in English, at least. Nevertheless, I would implore anyone to do a bit of reading regarding Peter Watkins or August Strindberg in general, extraordinary fascinating individuals both. Now, go forth, stand up for yourself, and don't let yourself be attacked or belittled by the secret sociopaths of your life. The dichotomy between speaking one's mind versus adhering to some higher, truer series of ethics. That is the Freethinker, and that is perhaps one of the great dilemmas we face as a society today, when, as I said, we all have the capacity to be an August Strindberg. I mean, to be a firebrand or a wannabe firebrand iconoclast, right? But is that good in and of itself, or is there something more wholesome, something more vital and important that's worth appealing to, that's worth fulfilling, than simply our own lack of satisfaction and our own discontent being acknowledged, if you will. Who knows? Maybe one day we'll find out. It's possible. In any case, have a fantastic day all.